In this video, I'm going to give just sort of the briefest of overviews of how hunger and satiety works. This is an incredibly complex topic with just a ton of literature on it. You can look at the description down below to see just the number of references that I've needed for this video. And so if you want to look deeper into it, then I would highly recommend checking out those references. But this is just going to be sort of an introduction to the topic. And so what we're going to be mostly talking about are events happening in the hypothalamus, which is located right here in the brain, so just above the pituitary gland. So if we take a closer look, it's this green part here, which is above the pituitary gland, which is this right here. And the hypothalamus in general is in charge of a lot of the sorts of, base instinctual type things like wanting to eat and sleep and those kinds of things. And so it makes sense that it would be next to the pituitary gland because that's the body's master gland. That's the gland that sends out hormones that interact with all the other glands in the body and tells those to sort of turn on and off. And so the hypothalamus is kind of in control of that. And so the hypothalamus is itself a very complex part of the brain. And so neuroscientists have broken it down into these nuclei that they call them. And so the ones we are interested in for this are the arcuate nucleus, which is sort of, right down here, right near the pituitary gland, and the paraventricular nucleus, which is a topic of great interest because it is involved in just a ton of different things that control the body's metabolism and things like that. And so anybody who has looked into hunger and satiety has probably encountered the hormones ghrelin and leptin, where ghrelin is the hunger hormone and leptin is the satiety, or I guess the not hungry hormone. And so ghrelin is produced in the cells of the gastrointestinal tract and will then circulate through the bloodstream and reach the brain and tell you that you are feeling hungry, where leptin is a hormone made by adipose cells, and that will then also circulate through the blood, get to the brain, and tell you that you are not hungry. And both of these hormones have just a bunch of other different things that they affect as well. A lot of things, like insulin sensitivity and blood glucose levels, and a lot of other sort of metabolic processes. But the ones we are interested in here and that these are most known for is being the hunger hormone ghrelin and the satiety hormone leptin. And so these affect two different types of cells in the hypothalamus, in the arcuate nucleus, the arcuate nucleus in particular. And so the ghrelin is activates, so that's why it has this plus here, these NPY-AgRP neurons, which are sort of the hunger neurons. And then leptin inhibits these neurons and it turns on these POMC neurons, which are involved in signaling satiety. This shows ghrelin inhibiting the POMC neuron, but it does not actually do that directly like it shows in this image, and I will talk about that here right now, as a matter of fact. So this is a sort of simplified look at this, and so what we see, we have our ghrelin coming from the intestinal tract, We have our insulin coming from the pancreas and our leptin coming from the fat cell. So the ghrelin comes up, it comes up here and it binds with this GHSR1A receptor on the NPY-AGRP neurons, which are the hunger neurons. And so this shows a blue arrow that means it's activating. This shows insulin and leptin activating the POMC, also sometimes called CART. And CART, I think, actually stands for like cocaine and amphetamine something or other. I don't remember offhand, but that's kind of interesting. But I will be calling it the POMC. And so we see that, well, one thing to also notice is that both of these have to cross the blood-brain barrier. So we see leptin is activating the the POMC neurons in the ARC, the arcuate nucleus, and these bind to the OBRB receptors. And what we see here is Ghrelin coming and activating the NPY-AGRP, which then activates GABA, which activates GABAergic neurons which then signal to inhibit the POMC, and that is actually how the Ghrelin inhibits the satiety neurons. It doesn't actually bind to them directly. And so these POMC then signal these MSH to the paraventricular nucleus here and activates it, whereas these AGRP neurons signal with AGRP, which inhibits these paraventricular nucleus neurons. And so the paraventricular nucleus, when it's activated, inhibits the feeling of hunger or food intake. And when it's inhibited, it's no longer inhibiting food intake, and so that's what makes you feel hungry. And so before I get to that, I wanted to show, so these are a few of the peptide hormones that we're talking about. So just the, so this is the structure of neuropeptide Y. This is its sequence, and peptide YY, which are both talking about this tyrosine here. So that's the single letter code for tyrosine. So the main thing to notice is that these are all peptide hormones, and I spelled that wrong. I put the S and E backwards. But this is the AGRP peptide hormone right here. So that stands for agouti or agouti related protein, and we see the structure of that right here. Then this MSH is the, or alpha MSH is the melanocyte stimulating hormone, and that is also a peptide. So a lot of what we're talking about here are peptide hormones, and so this was the well, it's somewhat more complex than this, but still simplified. And I actually made a figure of my own that is even a little bit more detailed here, talking about how this works. And so I have down here in purple, these are some of the molecules that activate and inhibit these two types of neurons. So I have over here the AGRP NPY neurons, which are the hunger neurons, and that's why, well, in my mind, I made them green because it's kind of like saying go eat, where the POMC or pro-opiomelanocortin co-expressing neurons, or POMC, I put red, like stop eating. So that was kind of my logic there. And we see that glucose signals or activates the stop eating neurons over here, which makes sense. If we have a lot of glucose in the blood, that means we probably don't need to eat. So insulin also activates the stop eating neurons, and it inhibits the start eating neurons here. And we also see, so these are what they call the fast acting signals here. So serotonin, cholecystokinin coming from the intestine, and this PYY, so that peptide YY, are fast acting, and those signal once again to activate these stop eating neurons and inhibit the start eating neurons. And once again, we see here Ghrelin is activating the start eating neurons, which then activates these GABAergic parts of the neurons, which then inhibit the stop eating neurons. So it's stopping the stop, which means go. Then leptin, which is a sort of slow acting. So that's what signals that feeling of feeling full, even 2 hours after you've eaten lunch or whatever. And so that activates the stop eating neurons and inhibits the start eating neurons. And so what we see here, so as I said, this GABA will from the start eating neurons will inhibit the stop eating neurons. It also inhibits the parabrachial nucleus, which so this comes from a paper which will be linked to in the description down below. So it comes from a 2021 review article. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but sort of my interpretation, I guess you could say. So the parabrachial nucleus is involved in taste-guided behavior, sort of your favorite food kind of a thing, or there will be changes there, like if you start disliking a food because it made you sick once. And so the AgRP activates the anterior bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, or the BNST, which is also involved in behavioral responses to anxiety and stress. So when I was reading about it, it kept making me think of the term hangry, so that sort of stressed or angry feeling when you are hungry. And so this activates GABAergic or inhibitory neurons, and these can also be activated by somatostatin, which I talked about in the video on the stomach. And this BNST is becoming quite a topic of research as of late too, because as it says up here, and this comes from that same paper as the stuff about the parabrachial nucleus, it says the BNST forms a continuum with the amygdala. And so the amygdala, so a lot of people may have encountered the amygdala, and it's often talked about as like the fear center of the brain. So the BNST is very highly connected with the amygdala, and this even says is continuous with the amygdala. So it's essentially part of the amygdala. And so a little bit off topic, I've seen a lot of papers that talk about the BNST in terms of sexual dimorphism, where the BNST is very different between men and women, which, maybe is why they have different responses to anxiety and stress. And slightly even more off topic, I've even found papers that talk about how the BNST with this sexual dimorphism is actually expressed in transgender people prior to hormone therapy as the gender they identify as rather than as the sex they were born with. So, men who identify as women, so transgender women, will have a BNST that looks more like a woman than a man, even before they start taking hormones. But anyway, we will get back to our regularly scheduled program here. So I also have here that the lateral hypothalamus, which is just another nucleus in the hypothalamus, which is involved in reward and appetitive behavior, is actually inhibiting the stop eating neurons. And that makes sense if this is telling us like we want to eat that because it tastes good, the reward and appetitive behavior is going to tell us, is going to inhibit our ability to not eat it. That's why when you have some chocolate sitting out, it can be hard to not eat it all the time because of this lateral hypothalamus. And so kind of the big thing here, both of these types of neurons, the stop eating and the start eating neurons, signal to the paraventricular nucleus, which is sometimes PVN, sometimes PVH, the H being for hypothalamus. And so the stop eating signals to, well, they both signal to this melanocortin 4 receptor, also the melanocortin 3 receptor, but for simplicity I just put the 4 one here. So the stop eating actually activates the melanocortin 4 receptors in the paraventricular nucleus, where the start eating inhibits those. And we can see here that this cholecystokinin, which is a type of peptide hormone, like pretty much all these things we're talking about, which comes from a part of the brain, or it can come from the intestine, and that will come and activate these melanocortin 4 receptors, or MC4R receptors, and sort of tells the brain, or tells the paraventricular nucleus, which I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but this talks a bit about all the different things that the paraventricular nucleus does. And so, when this is activated, it tells us to stop eating. When these MC4R neurons are inhibited, it tells us to start eating. But anyway, this was the figure that I made, so that was just a little bit more detail on how this signaling works through the brain. So we go back here. This was our somewhat more simplified version. And up here, I guess, is sort of the very simple, this is sort of the main takeaway to remember. We have these NPY AgRP start eating neurons and these POMC stop eating neurons here. And they signal to the paraventricular nucleus here. So the AgRP inhibits the PVN neurons and tells us to start eating. This alpha MSH activates those neurons and tells us to stop eating. And now I will get into a little bit of the biochemistry with all this. So here we have Ghrelin, that's the green part. The pre-progrelin is sort of the precursor to Ghrelin, which is the hunger hormone. And so that's cleaved, and this green part comes off, and that is then the Ghrelin. And one thing to also notice about Ghrelin is that it is acylated, so it has a fatty acid bound to the serine in the third position here, and it's added by Ghrelin O acyltransferase, or GOAT. And that is actually necessary for Ghrelin to be active. If that's not on there, then the Ghrelin is inactive. And so leptin is also a peptide. So this is the structure of leptin. This is the amino acid view of it. So like I said, it's a peptide. And so we can look down here to sort of these signal transductions for how they work. So Ghrelin is a G protein coupled receptor. It doesn't show the G protein here. Well, actually, this is the G protein, but that activates the phospholipase C, which then cleaves off from the cell membrane this inositol phosphate here to generate this inositol triphosphate, and it results in this diacylglycerol. The inositol triphosphate goes to the endoplasmic reticulum. It causes calcium to be released, and that activates other proteins, including like this AMP activated kinase. And it makes sense that this AMP kinase would be AMP activated, because AMP tells us that we are low on energy, because after ATP donates phosphates, it becomes ADP and AMP, So that signals low energy, and Ghrelin tells us to eat, so it's going to want to use low energy, this low energy sort of activated kinase. And those go down here and activate these transcription factors like FOXO1, PCREB, which then tells these neurons to express more NPY and AgRP, which are those peptide hormones, those neurotransmitters. And the same thing we have here with our diacylglycerol activating protein kinase C and then going through this MAP kinase pathway to activate these transcription factors. And if we kind of divide down here, because this would actually be happening in different cells. We can look at the leptin, which binds this OBRB receptor here, which is a receptor tyrosine kinase. And it uses this JAK2 to actually phosphorylate the kinases. And so one of the main pathways on here is this STAT3. So STAT3 gets phosphorylated, which causes it to dimerize. That goes into the nucleus down here and acts as a transcription factor along with STAT5 to start, transcribing the MSH, the alpha MSH neurotransmitter or peptide hormone, and so that is the signal transduction pathway for leptin. One other thing I wanted to talk about with leptin is that it is alternative splices. So this LRB, which is also sometimes called OBRB, is sort of the main version for this leptin signaling in neurons. But we also have these truncated versions, which are found in the blood-brain barrier. And so those are actually for bringing leptin across the blood-brain barrier in order that it can, reach the neurons and, signal for satiety. And so there's this idea that's called leptin resistance, which one of the mechanisms proposed for that is that this blood-brain barrier leptin receptor is slowed down or inactivated, maybe by some genetic mutation. And what's interesting, though leptin is the the stop eating hormone, what they find is that people who are obese actually have greater levels, greater concentrations of leptin in their blood. And the reason for this is because of this leptin resistance or leptin insensitivity, because the receptors that bring leptin past the blood-brain barrier are working much slower. Even with the higher levels of leptin, it's not getting into the brain, so it's not telling you that you're not hungry anymore. So that's why obese people tend to have bigger appetites. And so the brain is sort of signaling back to the adipose tissue, hey, I'm not seeing any leptin here. What's going on. And so the fat tissue keeps generating more leptin, and that's why obese people oftentimes have more leptin in their blood than non-obese people. And so, back when leptin was first identified, it was thought that maybe it could act as, sort of like a dietary supplement. You inject leptin into somebody and it makes them not feel hungry, so they stop eating and lose weight. But, because of this leptin insensitivity, that actually doesn't work. You would actually need to get leptin past the blood-brain barrier. So there was also something, so I wanted to talk about, because I have a structure here for the Ghrelin receptor. And so what we can see here in magenta is actually the Ghrelin peptide, and then in this sort of more bluish purple is the actual receptor here. And if we look down further here, we see the G protein. And so this green one here is the gamma subunit, this cyan is the beta subunit, and this salmon here is the alpha subunit. Down here in brown, this is an antibody, and it's there to stabilize the structure during the cryo freezing process for X-ray crystallography. So that's not actually part of this protein complex. But we can see here the receptor. There's these green molecules here that are hydrophobic molecules, and those are present for stabilizing as well, because this part of the receptor would be embedded in the membrane, so it's hydrophobic, and so it requires having those hydrophobic molecules there. But the thing I wanted to point out was this gray thing down here is that fatty acid bound to our ghrelin. And so we see that that's actually down here in the binding pocket of the receptor. And so that is why that is actually necessary for ghrelin to bind to its receptor. And that's why it's necessary for ghrelin to be, it's necessary to have that attached to ghrelin in order for ghrelin to actually be active and functional. And so yeah, that was the ghrelin receptor. All right, so like I said, this is, a very sort of introductory treatment of the subject material. There is just tons more to all this. I haven't even gotten into how like leptin and ghrelin affect things like bone growth and the immune system and things like anxiety and things like that. So there's a lot more to this. And so once again, the takeaway here, we have these appetite, or the go eat neurons, as I've been calling them, which are the NPY-AgRP, and they signal to the paraventricular nucleus and they inhibit it. We have the satiety, or the stop eating neurons, as I've been calling them. They are the POMC neurons, and they activate the paraventricular nucleus. These MC4R neurons in the paraventricular nucleus, and that tells us to stop eating. And so, yeah, that is ghrelin and leptin, and this, once again, is all happening in the hypothalamus. And so, yeah, I think that is everything I wanted to talk about in this video. I hope you found this interesting, maybe even helpful when you're thinking about, your diet and all that kind of stuff. And I will see you in the next video.